Thanks everyone for joining us today. We are doing lunch and learn with different hosts, which we'll talk about here in a second. You're used to seeing Maggie, and it's holding the line. Key wins for Maine's 132nd legislative session. And thank you to all also watching the recording. We do record these and we put them on YouTube. My name is Keith Carson. I'm the Director of Environment and Science Communications for Maine Conservation Voters and Alliance. Some of you may know me from my old job as a meteorologist and climate communicator in Maine for a while. And I'm excited to step in as host today. Again, usually Maggie does a lovely job, and I'll aim for 50% is good. And Maggie's going to be one of our panelists today. So that's why we had to switch it up today. The conversation is about what's happened during this session, the wins, the progress, the unfinished work, and what it means for Maine people and the environment. Obviously, we're at a time right now where there's big federal headwinds, but still Maine moved forward in meaningful ways, and we continue to be a leader in protecting our environment and fighting climate change. We had a really successful session and made progress on energy affordability, climate accountability, land conservation, tribal issues, and clean energy access. And today we're going to hear directly from some of the people who led that work. This next slide here shows the organizations that make up the Environmental Priorities Coalition, or EPC. I believe we have 41 members now, and that brings advocates together around shared environmental priorities each session. Most of the bills that we're going to talk about today are EPC priority, or were EPC priority bills. We'll also highlight a few additional bills, including dark skies, data centers, and other important environmental legislation that has been advanced by our partners. So we've got a great group of partners today on our panel. Jackson Chadwick is going to be one of the speakers. He's the Advocacy and Organizing Director with Maine Youth for Climate Justice. Eliza Townsend is Maine Conservation Policy Director for the Appalachian Mountain Club. Maggie Summers, we just talked about, Outreach Director, and Sarah Woodbury, who is our Legislative Director for Maine Conservation Voters and Alliance. Mulian Bryant, who is Executive Director at the Wabanaki Alliance. Naomi Albert, who is the Manager of Community, Energy Planning, and Policy from Climate to Thrive. And Luke Frankel, who is Woods, Waters, and Wildlife Program Director and Staff Scientist at the National Resource Council of Maine. And I'm glad to see somebody who has a longer title than I do. That's nice, Luke. This program is really meant to give everyone a sense of where we are now and the possibilities ahead. Quickly, just a little bit about MCV. Our organization represents more than 13,000 members and supporters dedicated to building a thriving future for all by acting on climate crisis, protecting the environment, and safeguarding our democracy. MCA does that by bringing people and organizations together to educate, inspire, and advocate. And MCV by advocating for equitable policies, holding elected officials accountable, and hopefully winning elections. Since 2020, this weekly Lunch and Learn series has helped advance those goals, creating a shared space to explore our environmental and social history, policy priorities, climate action movement, and more. A couple of housekeeping things before we get going. We're going to hear from our presenters first, and then we're going to tackle your questions in the Q&A section at the end. You don't have to wait, though. If you have a question, please send your question to me or Gabe Cole directly. So a direct message through the chat as they occur to you. We'll aggregate all those and try to ask as many as we can following the presentations. We ask that you don't message the speakers directly because it's hard enough to present on Zoom with 8 boxes open anyways. So it can be a little bit distracting. And if you have any technical difficulties, do what I do, ask Gabe Cole through the chat, and he'll help you out. This event is being recorded, just so you know, and the video is posted on our YouTube channel, which you can check out some of our other Lunch and Learns when you get a chance. Okay, thank you so much. With all that, we're going to turn it over to Jackson.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Keith. And hi, everyone. My name is Jackson, and I am the Advocacy Director at Maine Youth for Climate Justice. Really excited to start today's Lunch and Learn by talking about the incredible momentum we've built for establishing a Maine Climate Super Fund. So we really set out this January with a clear mission to ensure that the most responsible for the climate crisis help cover the cost of the damages they have caused. And so in January, we had a remarkable Make Polluters Pay Day of Action. And if any of you attended that, we had a massive snowstorm the day before, but that didn't stop over 100 people from showing up to the State House and talking with their legislators about this bill. And one of the most moving parts of that was a climate impacts live gallery featuring the destruction that storms and flooding have caused in communities across our state. So, in its original form, the Maine Climate Superfund would have identified responsible parties or polluters that have caused damage to our climate. And then it would have assessed a fine to those polluters that they would pay into a climate superfund program. So this year in the Environment and Natural Resources Committee, the bill did undergo a fairly big amendment. So it was reconsidered by the committee and turned into a resolve. And that resolve directs the state of Maine to conduct a assessment of the financial impacts of greenhouse gas emissions on things like our economy, our public health, infrastructure, biodiversity, and natural resources. And it's specifically looking at a time period between 1995 and 2024. So this study, this report, would include a detailed financial analysis of these costs, and that is due back to legislators at the start of 2028. So that will be for the second regular session of the 133rd legislature. And one really important thing about that is it gives legislators the ability to report out a bill that year if they choose that could establish the Climate Superfund program to hold climate polluters responsible. So we're setting a really, really great foundation for a Maine Climate Superfund in the future. And I just wanted to, give a huge thank you to everyone who contacted their representatives and senators. We had like an overwhelming number of action alerts and communications and people who signed petitions and reached out to their elected officials asking them to support this bill. And that really did pay off in the end. So thank you for doing that. And I guess I'll just close by saying that, Maine has officially moved the needle on this issue in a national context. We are the only state to date in 2026 to have passed some form of climate superfund legislation or legislation that lays the foundation for a climate superfund. States like New Jersey and Minnesota are considering similar bills at this time, but to date, we're the only state that has taken action through the legislature. So just huge props and huge thank you to everyone on this call who has helped support this bill. There will definitely be a lot more opportunities for engagement in the near future, so stay tuned for those. And I believe I'll pass it over to Eliza Townsend to talk about LMF.
Thanks, Jackson. Thank you, MCV, for this opportunity. I am Eliza Townsend. I'm Maine Conservation Policy Director for the Appalachian Mountain Club. And I want to say that I'm appreciative of the opportunity to talk about Land for Maine's future, one of my favorite topics. And I want to emphasize that the success that we had this year was a team effort. So while I'm doing the reporting, there are a lot of other people who could be doing it. And I'm particularly grateful for the work of Maine Conservation Voters, the Natural Resources Council of Maine, Maine Audubon, the full Environmental Priorities Coalition, and the full Land for Maine's Future Coalition. So, LMF. You know that Maine's economy and culture are rooted in our connection to the land and water. Today, outdoor recreation contributes $3 billion to our economy every year, and tourism generates $16 billion. They both rely on access to the land and water. But by the mid-1980s, there was widespread recognition that the access that we had long enjoyed was increasingly being lost to development pressure and changing land use patterns. In response, the legislature asked voters to approve a $35 million bond question, which the voters supported strongly, and the Land for Maine's Future program was born. I want to share a piece of the establishing statute because I can't improve on it. It reads, the legislature finds that Maine is blessed with an abundance of natural resources unique in the northeastern United States, that these natural resources provide Maine residents and visitors to the state with an unparalleled diversity of outdoor recreation opportunities during all seasons of the year, and a quality of life unmatched in this nation, that the continued availability of public access to these recreation opportunities and the protection of scenic and natural environment are essential for preserving the state's high quality of life, that public acquisition programs have not kept pace with the state's expanding population and changing land use patterns, so that Maine ranks low among the states in publicly owned land. It goes on, but I think that's the poetry that I wanted to capture. So the program immediately got to work and began protecting public access to some of the most iconic and beloved places in the state. Some early examples include Dodge Point in Lincoln County, Mount Kineo in Piscataquis County, the Namacanta Public Lands, again in Piscataquis County, Mount Agamenticus in York County, and the Aroostook Valley Rail Trail in Aroostook County. We can move to slide 2. The program has been very successful through the years because it is bipartisan. It enjoys bipartisan support and strong public support, and it has earned that support because the program has a proven track record and it supports Maine's heritage industries and saves taxpayer dollars. LMF projects require a 1-to-1 match, which helps incentivize private investment in land conservation. The program directly supports Maine's farming, forestry, fishing, and outdoor recreation industries. The vast majority of lands conserved through LMF remain on the tax rolls, which helps to ensure that conserved land continues to support municipal budgets. And these projects are all community driven. They only occur between willing sellers and willing buyers. In some cases, they do require approval from local governments and have gotten it. The scoring system for how projects are awarded is also carefully crafted to ensure that there's a proper balance between urban and rural areas. And we can move to slide 3, which will show us the distribution of projects across the state. So it has conserved land in all 16 counties, 75 recreational water access sites, 45 farms totaling more than 10,000 acres, 33 commercial working waterfront properties from York to Eastport, over 1,200 miles of shorelands, over 158 miles of former railroad corridors, which are now recreational trails, over 650,000 acres of conservation and recreation lands that guarantee access for traditional outdoor recreational opportunities from hiking, hunting, birdwatching, fishing, and trapping, and more than 333,000 acres of working forest lands that remain in private ownership while permanently protected. We can move to slide 4. And we need to do more. Conserving land is critical for recreational access, obviously, but also for the protection of our food systems and for our economy. It's also one of the absolute most basic things that we can do to address two of the most pressing environmental issues of our time, climate change and its sister issue, biodiversity loss. Trees and plants absorb carbon, they hold it, and they eventually contribute it to the soil. Open space allows both wildlife and plant species to move in response to warming temperatures, and varied and connected habitats are essential to ensuring the continued variety which makes up ecosystems or life on Earth. So it's no wonder that the Climate Action Plan calls for conserving 30% of Maine's land by 2030. Unfortunately, to date, we have only conserved 22% of Maine's land. We've got some work to do to catch up. Development pressures have not gone away. They have only grown in the wake of the pandemic. And opportunities are very much at risk for lack of funding. But there's good news. So we can move to the next slide. Over the years, Land for Maine's Future, as you can see, has been funded primarily through bonds. And that is a really legitimate way of funding this program. Most of us borrowed money to buy our houses, for example, and that's what a bond is. It's the state borrowing money. But bond questions require a two-thirds vote of support of the legislature, and in recent years, that has just gotten harder and harder to accomplish. So therefore, we all have turned to other funding sources. And in 2021, the legislature approved a $40 million appropriation to be distributed over a four-year period. That was wonderful, thank goodness. And this year, thanks to the leadership of Senator Teresa Peirce, along with the Mills administration, the legislature, the budget committee specifically, dedicated 25% of the interest gained on the state's rainy day fund to Land for Maine's future. That is projected to generate about $7 million a year, assuming the rainy day fund is at a good high level. So predictable funding is a really good win. However, those of us who enjoy the benefits of conserved land will need to continue to speak up loudly and clearly going forward to make sure that it continues. And I will hand the microphone to Maggie Summers.
Thank you so much, Eliza, and hi, everyone. I'm so glad to be part of today's panel. On this side of the interview, I'm really excited to talk about the Energy Fairness Act because this bill has been a major part of my work this year. And so just a little bit about the history about this work. It started from a simple but urgent reality, which is that electricity is essential. It's how people heat their homes, keep food cold, charge medical devices, stay connected, work from home, live safely. But for many Mainers, electricity bills have become high, unpredictable, and really hard to understand. And so when people get a bill that they can't afford, they're often left feeling like it's their own personal problem. But what I have been seeing across the state and what so many people across Maine already know is that this isn't an individual problem, it's a systems problem. And so that's why my colleague Lucy and I started putting on public education events around utility bills to help people understand what they're actually paying for, where those costs come from, and where the decisions about those costs get made. We just really wanted the energy system to feel a little bit less like a black box, that nobody really knows what's going on. And so a lot of this work became the foundation for the Energy Fairness Act. And some of you may remember the original version of the bill was a lot broader. It was really a fairness package. It included stronger shutoff protections for vulnerable customers, including older Mainers, infants, people with medical conditions. It required better reporting on customer hardship, including debt and disconnections. It included stronger utility accountability provisions, limiting some of the costs utilities could pass on to customers, including lobbying related costs, legal costs to argue against ratepayers for higher rates, and excessive executive compensation. It also did include protections from competitive electricity providers, which often target or mislead low-income Mainers who are already struggling. And it would have created fairness and affordability standards that would have been backed up by fines that could have been returned to customers if utilities failed to meet those standards. And so really at the core of the bill was if electricity is essential, then affordability, transparency, and fairness have to be central too to how we regulate utilities. And as often happens in the legislature, the bill was changed. It was whittled down. And so some of the strongest consumer protection and utility accountability pieces did not make it into the final version. But what did pass is still a meaningful step forward. It includes a new affordability metric that the PUC has to consider when they're making rate decisions. It includes more transparency around utility practices and a review of delivery costs that make up a majority of part of people's bills. So the affordability metric may sound technical, but it is really important. Right now, people talk about affordability and energy affordability all the time, but there hasn't been a clear, consistent way for the Public Utilities Commission to measure how electricity bills affect household burden. And this metric is meant to help make affordability part of the commission's decision making. And so it's not just something that advocates will be raising from the outside. It's actually going to be coming from the inside of the commission as well. And this law also requires the PUC to publish credit and collection data from large transmission and distribution utilities, giving the public better information about how things like disconnections, payment arrangements, and how utilities are treating customers who are struggling to pay their bills. And it also requires a comprehensive review of electric delivery rates. And that matters a lot because, as I mentioned, delivery costs are a major part of people's bills. So this review will look at how those rates could be designed to contain costs, reduce volatility, and increase transparency. So, no, this law does not solve everything. It's not going to be magically lowering bills tomorrow, but it is really moving us in the right direction. It starts to put affordability into the structure of utility regulation in Maine. It creates more transparency. It opens up a serious review of delivery costs, and it gives us new tools to keep pushing. And so that larger goal is what has guided my organizing work. The fact that an energy system where everyone can access affordable electricity, where costs are transparent, where utilities are accountable, and where Maine people have a real voice in the decisions that shape their lives. So the Energy Fairness Act is not the end of that work. It's just the beginning. It's a foundation that we can build from. But I'm really, really glad that the state of Maine has taken this first step. Oh, and I'll pass it to Molly and Bryant, who's going to be talking about the Wabanaki Alliance bills.
Thank you, Maggie, and thank you all for including us today. We had a roller coaster ride of a session, I think, and I think the title of this talk, Hold the Line, is really accurate for kind of what we experienced as well this year. So, in the first year of this session, our priority bill was around eminent domain. It was really kind of laser focused on basically the lands that the tribes have right now. We don't want the state to be able to take them for eminent domain purposes. This bill passed the House and the Senate, and Governor Mills vetoed it, citing unintended consequences and all of that. So going into the second year of the session, we had a few other moving, things in the works, and the Judiciary Committee bills, which were kind of the biggest, flashiest things I think we had going on, started off as repeats of efforts we have tried and failed in the past. So we had LD 785 was the big omnibus sovereignty bill. We've seen this in prior legislatures, and this is the bulk of the recommendations of a task force from 2019 with various changes to the 1980 Maine Indian Land Claims Settlement Act. Also heard in the same day in the Judiciary Committee was LD 395, which is focused on access for Wabanaki people and nations to laws passed by the federal government meant to benefit tribes. These bills were, well, I'll start with the good stuff. We had two long, wonderful public hearings, lots of support for both of these efforts, a lot of engagement from tribal communities and our allies and friends throughout the state and lawmakers. A lot of them supported both of these bills in their original forms. In the committee process and in negotiations with the governor, these were amended to be a tax bill. LD 785 is now largely about tax provisions for tribal nations, and we've seen this in prior legislatures. In compromise bills, there's often tax things that are the outcome. And then 395 was changed to a task force about federal beneficial acts with a commitment to recommend legislation by the end of this calendar year. So those were both signed by Governor Mills. We also had a few other efforts going on. The conservation easements bill, this was LD 1054, and this bill it expands the definition of conservation easement to include the purposes of cultural, archaeological, and historical, and it also now includes tribes as entities that can hold these easements. And this is a good thing. It's really great to have tribal access and stewardship opportunities to pieces of land. And then Also, two things not on the slide that I wanted to cover quickly while we're talking about land. Of course, there is now the seat for a tribal person on the Land Use Planning Commission. That was a victory of this session with a lot of folks here. And Senator Craig Hickman also put in a bill to allow for free access to state parks for Indigenous people. So on the land topic, I apologize for not including those in the slide, but those are two good things that happen for the tribes. Probably our biggest win of the session was Wabanaki Studies movement. So there's a law in the books from 2001 that requires the teaching of Wabanaki Studies in schools. It has never had a lot of great implementation around it or commitment from the state to kind of put their money where their mouth is. And now it does. The Wabanaki Studies specialist position is funded in the governor's supplemental budget this year, and LD 1474 is supporting that work that she has created. So a team of advisors and curriculum development and all that sort of thing. And then my last bullet, I just wanted to keep up this notion of environmental, I called it injustice, because there was a chance to kind of slow the roll of the expansion of Juniper Ridge landfill that is right next to my home community. There's an op-ed in the Bangor Daily News today about this and how we're feeling about Juniper Ridge landfill overall and its threat to our people and our river. So there was a bill that would have prevented the expansion of landfills into wetlands, but then it got murky on if that would even, have a role in the expansion of Juniper Ridge, because that process is already underway. This bill was amended in committee to have stronger PFAS testing provisions and good things around that work. And also it protects another site for a potential state landfill up at Carpenter Ridge, which is also near Penobscot territory. Now that cannot be a site for a landfill, and Penobscot Nation will have first refusal on, being stewards of that piece of land. So that's sort of a wrap for the tribes this session. I thank you all for showing up for us time and time again. We had a lot of uncertainty and weren't sure what to expect out of this session. And I think we made some good progress for sure. So looking forward to the future and doing a lot of good work in between sessions here to help all of this move forward. And I will pass it over to Naomi.
Thanks so much. My name is Naomi, and I'm the manager of community energy planning and policy at A Climate to Thrive. And we really appreciate the opportunity to be part of the webinar and are really excited to share about plug-in solar, which just got enabled by recent Maine legislation. So just to describe what plug-in solar is, these are small portable systems that can be plugged into an outdoor outlet. And they are small, so they cover about 10 to 15% of a household's electricity usage, but can still be really impactful in terms of reducing electricity bills. And we're really excited about this because for the first time, it really opens up solar ownership for renters, people that live in apartments, or that can't access traditional rooftop solar. So very exciting. These systems have limited interaction with the grid. Most of the electricity is used in the home. And because of that, they are able to go through a different process where they don't need to go through interconnection with the utility. And so that can reduce some of the soft costs that are associated with traditional rooftop solar and make it more accessible and more affordable. And while this is much newer in Maine and in the United States, they're already popular in Europe. There's different estimates about how many of these are in Germany, somewhere between 780,000 and 4 million. So already very popular there. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, these will significantly bring down the cost for folks, making them more accessible. As I mentioned, they reduce some of those soft costs and some of those barriers and can be taken with you when you move. Next slide. So this was enabled through LD 1730 that was just signed this April, and this eliminates the interconnection requirements for these small plug-in solar devices, so devices that are smaller than 1,200 watts. And it also establishes safety requirements for them to ensure that they're safe for households. And then through this law, these systems have this carve out where they don't have to go through utility interconnection, but they're not eligible for net energy billing because they produce a smaller amount of electricity and the majority of that is used in real time on site. Next slide. So just a little bit more about the bill. For larger systems over 420 watts, folks would notify their utility. However, your utility cannot deny you a properly installed system. You cannot be required to pay a fee, and they do not need to approve it before you install the system. So it's just simply a notification. And then for smaller systems that are under 420 watts, there's no need to notify the utility. Next slide. And through this law, as part of the safety requirements, the systems need to be installed in accordance to National Electric Code standards. And so for most folks, that means having a qualified electrician, just ensuring that the wiring looks good. If you have that electrical know-how, it is not explicitly required to have an electrician if they're under 420 watts, but systems above 420 watts are required to have an electrician. Next slide, please. So this is super exciting, but there's a little bit of a waiting period because these systems are newer to the United States. They're still adapting the safety standards to our wiring. And so as part of the safety standards in the bill, systems in Maine need to be certified in compliance with UL, or formerly Underwriters Laboratory. This is a very common third-party safety verifier that certifies things like common household appliances like smoke alarms, etc. And so they're currently going through the process of certifying manufacturers. And so we're anticipating that certified systems will be available hopefully within the next year. And so while there are some systems that are currently available online, we're really encouraging folks to wait until the UL certified systems are available, since some of the ones that you can buy online technically are not legal through our law, and just to ensure home safety, getting the UL certified systems. I think that was the end of my slides. I'll pass it to Sarah. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Naomi. Once again, my name is Sarah Woodbury. I'm the legislative director here at Maine Conservation Voters. And I am going to talk to you about data centers. So this, I think probably most folks saw news articles and information about this bill this session. This was probably one of the most contentious and controversial pieces of legislation that was worked on this year, and got a ton of attention because many people care about data centers coming into their communities. MCV worked on this bill from the beginning with the bill sponsor, Representative Melanie Sachs, who is actually my rep here in Freeport. And so this bill started out as the original bill just called for a data center coordination council, which would have been set up to kind of come up with guardrails around what these data center systems that are being, put forward in the state of Maine, couldn't do around electricity and water usage and all of that stuff. But as the hearings kind of went on, they were hearing from more and more people about the concerns about possible incoming facilities that would be set up before this council, this coordination council did their work. So the bill was amended in committee to have a moratorium of 18 months to allow that coordination council to do that work, to make sure that when these systems come into the state of Maine, they do have those guardrails around them. For folks that don't know, there are a lot of other communities that have these like large scale data centers in them are seeing massive increases in their like electricity rates. I think the state of Virginia has seen something like a 267% increase in their electricity rates around these facilities. And there's also the water usage issue. They're estimating that the facilities in Texas will utilize up to 400 billion gallons of water in a 1-year time frame, which could bring down Lake Mead, which is one of the largest reservoirs, I think the largest reservoir in the country, but like 16 feet. And that's a lot of water. So like there's a huge concern about water usage. Maine, we are highly dependent on our clean water, our lakes, our rivers, our oceans. And so there was a lot of concern about water usage, not only the usage of the water, but what was ending up in the water. These facilities use, high heat, and so the water in a lot of these facilities is heated to massive massive temperatures, and then they're just putting that back in the environment, and that kills the fish and the livestock and everything kind of around those facilities with those high water temperatures. And so there's real concern about these facilities coming into Maine without guardrails around them, saying that the facilities are responsible for the electricity costs, making sure that they're not utilizing all of our water, making sure that they're not contaminating the communities where these facilities will come. One of the things that's utilized to cool down facilities that have high temperatures, particularly electrical facilities, is PFAS. We are already dealing with the PFAS contamination issue. So there's just a lot of concerns around these facilities. And so the bill had the moratorium in it. The governor had wanted an exemption for a facility that was going in J. And so that facility had started the process. It wasn't as far along in that process as I think was maybe intimated from the developers that were putting that facility forward, but that there was this request that this bill have this exemption for that J facility. The legislature did not want that exemption for the J facility. There was an amendment put forward, once again, by Representative Sachs, that would have amended the facility, but also put guardrails around what that facility could do. That amendment failed 115 to 29 in the House. So the bill went through, it passed bipartisan in both the House and the Senate. We had some really interesting floor speeches. Representative Toole, who's a Republican that represents some coastal communities, had heard a lot from like the lobstermen in his community and talked about the concerns from those communities around these facilities. We heard folks that had heard about facilities in Sanford concerned about the size of that facility and there not being any guardrails. So there was no real appetite for this amendment that would exempt J. So it went through. There was a lot of advocacy work that was done by our organization and other organizations. I will say that this issue was the issue that we got the most, engagement from our advocates this year. People desperately and really care about this issue and do not want these facilities to just be built willy-nilly throughout Maine without some sort of guardrails around them. Unfortunately, the governor did veto the bill because the J exemption was not in there. She did, however, do an executive order that still sets up that data coordination council on the similar timeline as to what was in the bill. Unfortunately, the difference with her council and the one that came out of the bill, the coordination council that was put forward in the bill had representatives from the tribal communities, had representatives from labor communities, environmental communities. It would be led by the DEP and the Department of Environmental Protection, trying not to speak in acronyms, and the Department of Energy Resources. And those are all in there. But what the original data council didn't have was industry lobbyists on that council. So the governor established her council by executive order. There is 2 slots on that for industry lobbyists. So whoever is appointed to that council, we will really have to make sure that whoever that is can push for those guardrails and make sure that going forward, communities in Maine are protected from the impacts of these, really large data center facilities that have been shown to kind of damage the communities around them. So MCV will continue to work on this issue. We will continue to make sure and push for policies that protect the communities while at the same time, allowing the fact that these facilities can be necessary for for the technology that we use every day, but making sure that they cannot come into the state of Maine and utilize all of our water, contaminate our oceans and our rivers and our lakes, and jack up our already incredibly high electricity prices. So we will continue to work and push for those types of policies. The Data Center Council that has been set up can recommend legislation for the next legislative session. And so hopefully we can work on that and try to get some good policies in place to protect Mainers moving forward. So with that, I'm going to pass it back. Oh, and I did want to make it clear that the bills that were before, most of those were EPC priority bills. This one was not an EPC priority, and the other two that we're going to talk about are not EPC priority bills. So we have a good mixture here of what was part of the broader environmental community bills and then some more targeted pieces of legislation. So with that, I'm going to turn it over back to Eliza, I believe, who has one more bill to talk about.
Thanks, Sarah. Glad to be back. This is, as Sarah said, another bill that was not on the Environmental Priorities Coalition list, but it was a win, and it's a topic I love to talk about, so how could I pass up the chance? So what is the issue with outdoor lighting? Through most of history, humans have relied on the positions of the stars to track time, to navigate, to guide cultural and agricultural practices. The skies have inspired art, music, literature, mythology. This winter, they were one of the grounding things that have kept me a little sane in a difficult time. I could go outside and there was Orion, right? Reliable. But light pollution, the human alteration of outdoor light levels, is a growing problem. And increasingly in the modern world, humans are no longer connected to the most fundamental of natural experiences. In fact, a 2019 atlas found that 1/3 of humanity and 80% of North Americans cannot see the Milky Way. So the photo in the upper right-hand corner here is taken at Appalachian Mountain Club's Little Lyford Lodge. And we have had the experience of families visiting our facilities and the children being surprised to learn that the stars that they could see there also hang over their homes back in the city because they've never seen them. And that just breaks my heart. Light pollution isn't just a matter of aesthetics, though. Bad lighting kills insects, it harms bird migration, it disrupts animal reproduction and the life cycle of plants. And we're experiencing a biodiversity crisis with dramatic decreases in animal populations worldwide between 1970 and 2018. It's estimated that 40% of animals and 34% of plants are at risk of extinction. We need to do all that we can do to retain the web of life on Earth. Retaining that diversity is one of the most basic strategies for slowing and mitigating climate change. And of course, humans are animals, and our bodies are attuned to the 24-hour cycle of light and dark. Exposure to light round the clock disrupts our sleep cycles. It has negative impacts on our physical and our mental health. Studies have found that exposure to artificial light at night is correlated to very serious health risks. Now, those studies were conducted with indoor light. We cannot say with absolute certainty about the impact of outdoor light, but there's something we can do about it. And so that was why I was really pleased to work with a fun pairing of legislators, for those of you who know them, a liberal Democrat, Representative Lori Osher, and a very, very conservative Republican, Senator Stacey Guerin. We worked alongside Maine Audubon and Dark Sky Maine to pass an act to promote responsible outdoor lighting. And this common sense bill puts us alongside about 16 other states in trying to address light pollution. The fact that it had bipartisan support was fun, and I really enjoyed working with one of the most conservative members of the Senate, where it ultimately got a 2/3 vote, and that doesn't happen very often. It was fun to witness. So we can move to the next slide. The bill goes into effect October 1st, and what it does is that it requires that going forward, new and renovated public facilities, so those are state, county, municipal, or private facilities that use public grant funds, or also in situations where facilities are replacing light fixtures, they have to use dark sky friendly lighting. And that means it's pretty simple: pointed down, shielded so the light doesn't spill, with a wattage that does not exceed 125% of the levels recommended by the Illuminating Engineering Society. and of a warm color temperature. Non-essential lighting must be turned off between 10 p.m. and sunrise. It allows, but does not require, towns to adopt local lighting ordinances. And it directs the Maine Office of Community Affairs to develop a model ordinance as time and staff allow. It has a raft of exemptions for transportation, for emergencies, for construction, for seasonal lighting. And I learned in the course of this bill that there are a handful of ski areas owned by towns. So think the Camden Snow Bowl and Black Mountain. And those are exempted. It allows several state agencies to develop rules for implementation, all of which will be developed through a public process, and they're all major substantive rules, which means that they will return to the legislature for approval. So let's go to the next slide. How can you help? You can use dark sky friendly lighting at home. It's readily available on the market. It's not more expensive. It will save your electricity costs in the long run. You can stay engaged as this rulemaking proceeds, and please get in touch with me if you'd like to know how. You can talk to your community leaders about a local ordinance. I mentioned how much fun I had watching the stars, but I don't get the view that you would think that I could get in rural Maine, because there is a street light directly outside our living room window that illuminates the entirety of our backyard. You can host a public education event, because that really is the key. I think that when people understand this issue, they get excited about it. And we, by and large, get only positive reactions. And you can get informed. And I've listed here 4 really terrific books that go into far greater detail. I've just finished a couple of them, so I'm pretty passionate about this topic. The middle one there, If You Can See the Dark, was co-written by my friend Jenny Ward, and it is a children's book, and it's terrific. And now I want to talk about safety. Well, actually, before I do that, let's just say about public education that we at AMC host an annual event that sells out as soon as we list it, and that the Stars Over Katahdin, hosted by the Friends of Katahdin Woods and Waters, draws over 200 people to rural Maine every year. And so those are examples of people being willing to pay to experience what they cannot experience at home. Rural communities like Greenville and Rangeley have recognized this and have adopted or are in the process of adopting ordinances. And that adds to the reasons to visit these beautiful places. And they're also experiencing savings. So the town of Greenville actually converted its streetlights, and as soon as they did, they saved $10,000 in the very first year. So now let's talk about safety, and we can go to the next slide. I think we've had it kind of drilled into us from a very young age that dark equals scary. If you're a Disney movie watcher, you've seen those images over and over. Popular culture reinforces that we should be afraid of the dark and that bad things happen in the dark. But if you have driven down rural roads in Maine at night, surely you have had the experience of being blinded by those halogen lights coming at you, where that is all you can see and you can no longer determine where the edge of the road is. Then you've gotten an introduction to the dangers of bad lighting. And so I just want to ask you to have a look at this slide of this garage, and we can see there are 3 very bright lights, none of them directed or shielded. They're blinding us. So let's look at the next slide. What happens when you block that light? Guess what? There is somebody lurking in the dark. You're better able to see what your surroundings and be prepared if you are afraid of the dark, if you're actually just lighting what you need to see and not being blinded by bad lighting. So I just want to reassure us all that we can have responsible outdoor lighting. It'll save us money, and it will actually be the safer way to go. And I will pass the baton.
All right, I think I'm next. Hello, everyone. My name is Luke Franco. I'm the Woods, Waters, and Wildlife Director and Staff Scientist at NRCM, and I'm going to quickly wrap up today here and talk about 2 other bills this session that were big wins for the environment. And as Sarah mentioned, these bills are not EPC priorities. So the first is LD 1904, which is a bill that establishes a revolving legal fund to help municipalities in Maine enforce shoreland zoning laws. So in Maine, we're very fortunate to have very strong shoreland zoning protection, but these laws are only effective if they are actually enforced. And unfortunately, in Maine, we hear many instances where landowners intentionally violate shoreland zoning laws, knowing that they can essentially just outlawyer these resource-limited municipalities and do whatever they want to their shoreland property, knowing that there eventually won't be any consequences. And there was a high-profile case a few years back on Sebago Lake, which is what the photo on the right is showing, where a landowner, egregiously violated shoreland laws in the town of Raymond and replaced the vegetative buffer with riprap. And this is exactly the type of activity that this bill is aimed at enforcing. So this new fund that will be established later in the year will give municipalities the opportunity to essentially apply for a loan from the state to pay for legal support to take egregious violators to court. And then when the case is settled, these municipalities will be required to repay the loan back to the fund so that it can continue on into the future to help other municipalities handle other legal claims. The bill also establishes a new staff person at DEP to administer the fund and help municipalities with other shoreland zoning issues. So this really is a big win for water quality in Maine, and I want to shout out Senator Tim Nangle for his leadership in bringing this bill forward, and then also Maine Audubon, who helped really lead the effort in getting this bill passed. Next slide. And the second bill that I wanted to highlight today is LD 870, which is a bill to modernize Maine's Land Use Planning Commission. For those who don't know, the Land Use Planning Commission is the planning and zoning authority for Maine's unorganized territories. And the unorganized territories are called UT, is the parts of the state that lacks local municipal government. And you can see a map on the right shows where the UT is located in Maine. And you can see that these areas span over 10 million acres and it's over half of the state. So it's a pretty significant chunk of Maine. And because these areas have no municipal government, whenever a landowner wants to do anything like build a new home or anything else that would require approval from a planning board in an organized municipality, they need to get approval through the LUPC. So these areas are as you can see in the more rural parts of the state, unsurprisingly, and as a result contain some of our most important and cherished natural resources. You often hear people talk about the North Maine woods. That general area overlaps with a large portion of the unorganized territories, and it's an area of our state that's critical for our outdoor recreation economy. And other things. So now that I've kind of highlighted how important this region is and what the kind of underlying regulatory framework, I'll get into what that bill actually did. So currently, the Land Use Planning Commission is composed of 9 board members, with one member representing the statewide interest at large, and 8 members representing the 8 counties that contain the most acreage within the UT. And this bill essentially adds more voices to the table by adding 2 additional members to the board, with 1 member representing the Wabanaki Nations, appointed on a joint recommendation from the 4 federally recognized tribes in Maine, and as well as an additional member added to represent the statewide interests at large. And so, as many of you know, a large portion of the land owned and managed by the Wabanaki Nations in Maine is located in the UT. And many areas in this region also hold significant cultural significance to the Wabanaki people. So it's great that they now finally have a seat at the table for big decisions that help change this landscape. And the bill, this addition of the statewide representative is also important because this region holds so much significance to the economic health and future prosperity of Maine. And the bill, in addition to adding the 2 members, also updates qualifications for the commissioners. It requires that they have a connection to the UT, either through current or past residency in the region or significant work experience in the UT. And it also requires that they have experience in related fields, including wildlife biology, land use planning, outdoor recreation, or other natural resource-based businesses. And the bill also adds one final thing, term limits to the commissioners. They currently don't have any term limits, and now under the law, they're capped to two consecutive 4-year terms. So that's another added bonus. So together, this bill really modernizes the Land Use Planning Commission and helps ensure that we have sound regulatory action for this important part of the state. And with that, I'll kick it back to Keith to maybe do a very brief Q&A.
Yeah, thank you, Luke, and thank you to all of our speakers. We have gotten some great questions. I'm going to try to direct them at the people that I think they are directed at, and we're going to do that in just a second. But I do want to point out that something that probably came through to everyone today is that these wins that we got through these bills didn't happen by accident, and they happened because advocates and community members and tribal leaders, young people, and legislators all kept showing up across Maine. And so that work continues. And one of the most important things people on this call could do to keep these conversations going in your own communities and talking to your neighbors and candidates that are running for office in your area, regardless of party, about the issues that matter for Maine's future, which are affordability, clean energy, land and water, tribal issues, and climate accountability. So we appreciate it if you stay connected with all of our organizations and keep showing up. That is always helpful to us. So we've got some questions here. I do want to point out this Lunch and Learn is extended because we had actually, kudos to all the speakers. Y'all were like in time, which is so hard to have everybody do that. But we've extended it a bit so we can answer some of your questions. Let me start with, this should be directed, I believe, at Naomi. The question is, will plug-in solar be affected by tariffs? And how much training will be needed by electricians?
Yeah, so that's a great question regarding tariffs. And the manufacturers of plug-in solar have primarily manufactured kits designed for use in like Germany so far. And so I think it's similar to any type of a solar product. There's often components that do come from overseas, and so there could be vulnerability to tariffs. I will say that a large percentage of the cost of getting a plug-in solar kit currently is from the shipping costs because there's not a large developed market in the United States yet. Often these kits are shipped individually, and so that really increases the cost from that individual shipping. And one thing that we've been exploring to help address that is to work with communities to do bulk purchasing programs so that if we can use our collective buying power and purchase a large amount of these kits at the same time, we can then reduce the shipping costs and make this more affordable for folks. So sorry if that's not super conclusive answer on the tariffs front. I think it's difficult to say. In regards to the electrician, it should be a fairly simple process for an electrician to install. And so we've been in early conversation with electricians as well. And that's another thing that we're hoping through a bulk purchasing program to help to streamline the process for homeowners or renters to get access to an electrician to help them install one of these systems.
Hey, great. Thank you. I think that answers those two questions well. The next one is, I believe, directed at Jackson. And the question is there anything we can do at the state level to protect ourselves from the potentially impending federal legislation granting immunity to fossil fuel companies from legislation, regulation, and litigation to hold them accountable for their detrimental environmental and health impacts? What a strongly worded question. Jackson, what do you got on that?
Yeah, that's a really great and timely question. I think what they're referring to is the Stop Climate Shakedowns Act of 2026, which has been proposed in the US Congress. I'm not sure where that legislation is at, but it would shield fossil fuel companies from things like climate deception lawsuits. It would try to avoid climate superfund laws in various states. And so there is a national organizing coalition through Make Polluters Pay that is fighting back against that legislation. They have an active petition that folks can sign, and maybe that's something that could be included in any follow-up resources. But that's a good way to get started and get in the loop about what's happening. Fossil-free media, which kind of facilitates this Make Polluters Pay coalition, is also having monthly organizing calls on that, where they go into detail about how you can participate in the process of advocating against that, and resources for contacting your elected officials at the federal level. So I hope that answered the question.
I think as best as anyone could predict the future of that, yes, I think so. Molly Ann, question for you. Do you have any more insights, two-part question actually, insights into the unintended consequences you referenced in the veto conversation on the eminent domain bill? And then also for people who aren't as familiar with tribal state policy issues, how can they understand the progress that was made this session and also, what work remains?
Well, I'm glad we have until 1:30. That's a meaty one. So the eminent domain veto, the governor basically said this is a solution in search of a problem because the state has not used eminent domain on tribal land. However, that's only the case since 1980. So before 1980, the state did use eminent domain to put a road right through the community of Sabayak over near Eastport. And the reason this is an issue is because in the 1980 Settlement Act, one of the many problems there is it gives tribes kind of municipality status. So it means that the state is able to do this. In other parts of the country, you wouldn't see this happening. Tribes have that relationship with the federal government that supersedes anything with the state. So I believe the federal government could come in and seize tribal land probably, but you wouldn't hear of the state doing it in other places. The other part of her concern was kind of citing what if we wanted to do a clean energy project or something of that nature, and it just had to be on tribal land, which is sort of, to us, there's so little tribal land in the state of Maine that I'm quite sure they could figure out another way around that instead of taking the land we had left. It was also amended in committee to make it applicable to current trust lands only. So we're talking about not that much of the state. And the broader issue of tribal sovereignty and why I believe the question is kind of talking through the progress we made this session and understanding it in a broader way going forward. We have a really unique set of circumstances here in Maine because of that act I'm talking about from 1980. And that settlement came about because roughly 2/3 of the state was stolen from Wabanaki people. And this has been validated in court. The treaties that oversaw a lot of this theft were never ratified by the federal government. So it was a very, righteous lawsuit, I think, at the time. And the settlement that came out of this it dealt with land, it dealt with money, but not even to the full extent, in my opinion, that it should have. And also the state was really good at negotiating because they were able to put in some really restrictive language that sort of relegates the tribes to municipality status and blocks us from accessing federal Indian law. So part of our charge here is to break down some of the fear around these changes. The opposition to these is sort of, this is too big, it's too broad, it'll be confusing. And we come from the place of wanting to educate about why it's none of those things, and we can get through it together. And there's a whole lot of opportunity on the other side of this. If the tribes are able to partner with the state in a way that other tribes are throughout the country, we can bring in more resources, we can create a lot of rural jobs and opportunities, and we can work on those clean energy projects. We'll have a lot more bandwidth and capacity and resources to do so. So we're looking sort of to the other side of this fear and confusion, and I think we're pretty excited about it.
All right, thank you, Melanie. And sorry to toss you such a aggressively in-depth question there. The next one is actually Eliza. Given LMF is, as you noted, bipartisan, wondering why it is you feel the 2/3 majority needed for a bond is a hard road. Do you have any sense of how far away from that type of majority we are even on something that's bipartisan like this?
Sadly, we're pretty far, and so I can say it based on experience. We've run bond questions and lost them because they did not get the adequate threshold to get sent out to voters. I don't have those numbers right at my fingertips. But our colleagues in the farm and forestry community had a bond that one might have thought was supported by a wide variety of people of both parties, and sadly, it did not get passed. So it is. It's also just Maine is not exempt from the tensions that exist everywhere, and if you find yourself in the minority party, you have to look for ways to flex your muscle. And one of the ways you can do that is by voting against bonds. It's just reality. It's human nature. So that's part of the challenge. And I say this as a big enthusiastic supporter of bond questions. I'm not one of those folks who's like, don't borrow money.
Thank you. Maggie, host turned now answering questions. On Energy Fairness Act, do you have any insight as to, you talked about some of the consumer protections and how some of those were kind of stripped away in this process. Do you have any sense as to why that was, or what was the motivation for some of those consumer protections coming out of it?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, we know that there was some intense lobbying pressure from the utilities, CMP and Versant. And they did a really good job talking to members of the EUT committee and convincing them that certain consumer protections, like limiting what costs couldn't be passed on to customers, including lobbying related costs, excessive executive compensation, the legal costs that they pass on to us. So there was just some very, very intense lobbying pressure that made its way and ended up affecting the bill. So yeah, we're going to work on this next session too, and hopefully have a bit more friendly folks in the committee. And yeah, but definitely some intense pressure from outside forces.
All right, thank you, Maggie. For Luke, when you look at LD 807 and LD 1904, what do these wins tell you about where Maine is making progress environmentally?
There we go. Sorry, had trouble unmuting. Yeah, I think what it, I guess, the 1904, the shoreland zoning bill. I think what we kind of were just discussing how things can be relatively partisan. But I think one issue where we consistently see from state lawmakers where there is widespread bipartisan support is clean water, and I think we've seen that a lot with some of the recent PFAS legislation where it's received some good bipartisan support. And so I think that's an issue that when it's typically put before lawmakers, it typically gets widespread bipartisan support. So I think that's kind of in this bipartisan world that we live in, one highlight that I'd like to see. And then I think with what 870, I think people are really starting to recognize what a resource that we have in Maine. We have this huge unfragmented landscape in Maine in the North Woods that is largely it's even though it's largely owned by private landowners, it's largely accessible. And there's a growing, trend of people concerned about losing access to certain areas as new landowners come in and, gate and close off their property. But I think in general, lawmakers and others are starting to realize that we have a tremendous resource in the rural parts of our state that are really critical for our outdoor recreation economy, but that we need to be careful about how we steward these resources because there are growing threats and pressures, especially as Maine population continues to increase, and we have to fight against kind of uncontrolled sprawled development. But that people are starting to recognize we need to really steward these resources that we have.
Thank you, Luke. For Sarah on data centers, two-part here. It can feel technical and abstract to a lot of people. So, what is the simplest way you could explain why this issue should matter to ratepayers, and you talked a little bit about the natural resources. And the other is, in your estimation, is this bill, obviously it has been vetoed, is this something that's likely to come up again in some form?
So I think, and I will be the first to admit that like I am not an expert on our utility grid. And if Representative Sachs was here, I would have her help me with this one because she is. But these facilities, these large facilities end up putting a ton of pressure on the grid. And and we already have an aging infrastructure to begin with. And so they do like their use impacts the communities around them. And so you see increased utility rates kind of across the country. And there's a whole bunch of data out there that I unfortunately don't have at my fingertips, but maybe we can share. There's been studies by like Brookings, and like there's tons of articles in like Bloomberg and other places that talk about the like increased cost that people are seeing. Maine has some of the highest utility rates in the country, and I think Maggie can correct me, I think it might be the highest in New England. And so we can't afford for these facilities to come in and raise those rates even more, where the bulk of that will fall on the people that live in those communities or the surrounding communities. And so we just consistently see where these facilities come in, those rates go up. It's not just Virginia, like it's kind of all over the country. They're seeing it in like Texas, they're seeing it in like South Dakota. All of these states that have these large scale data center places come in are seeing their utility rates go up because of the sheer usage of these facilities. And in a lot of places, there's no guardrails around them that require them to cover the costs or pay for like infrastructure upgrades or things like that that could help mitigate some of those costs. And so that was the point of kind of the moratorium and this council, was to put those things in place before these facilities came in. So like for the facility that's coming into J, if that ends up happening, the developer says that they will not impact the grid for now. And so that's not just Jay. Like there are other communities, like we are a small state. We all kind of utilize the same facilities. And so that's not just going to be Jay that's going to see that. It's going to be, community, region wide, all that type of stuff. Our folks are going to see those. So like it is a thing that people should be concerned about, considering how much we are already paying for everything else. I mean, this isn't utility costs, but like I just paid $4.50 for gas, which is insane. And so that on top of utility costs, on top of the rising costs that we are seeing along the way, means that it's concerning for those communities for these facilities come in. In terms of the legislation, I do think that we are going to see something similar. I know that several legislators that I worked with this session super fired up about this issue and want to still try to move forward with some sort of bill that would. So if we have the study from the Coordination Council, they've got 18 months to do it. So we could come back and try to do another moratorium until that council finishes the work next year. Unfortunately, that would be too late for communities like Jay and like Sanford, which Sanford's facility is like massive compared to what Jay is looking at. But the hope is that Coordination Council will come up with those guardrails, so at least we can put them in place moving forward. It once again would not, it would not be looking back, so that would not help Jay, that would not help Sanford, that would not help any facilities that come in until then. So, but the hope is that yes, that they will move that forward, some sort of legislation moving forward. The other thing I will say is that local communities can do something now if they are concerned about this stuff. But like, I know that there's some organization going on in Sanford to try to at least put a pause on that large data facility that wants to come in there. There was some movement in Jay of possibly looking at a referendum. I'm not sure where that ended up, but like a lot, there's a moratorium in Bangor, like Wiscasset and Lewiston both stopped facilities from coming in. So until the state legislature, and whoever ends up in the governor's office next time around are in place, like local communities can do things to push back on these large scale facilities coming in. I know Maggie is going to want to do some organizing around this issue this summer. Some of our colleagues at like Slingshot and other organizations are already doing some of that organizing. So if you're interested in that, if you know of something coming to your facility and you want to be engaged in that, we can certainly help put you in contact with other folks. Or also Maggie can do that as well.
Thank you, Sarah. Yeah, certainly. Data centers has been a very hot issue. We're going to wrap up questions. There are one or two that I did see that are probably better suited for an offline conversation rather than to air it out to everybody here. Not that they were anything nefarious, they're just very, very specific. And I want to thank all of our speakers and everyone who joined us today. And remember, this conversation showed that even in a national difficult moment, we're still moving forward. And we're grateful to be in this work with all of you. So that's it for today's Lunch and Learn. Enjoy the rest of your lunch if you get one.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.